All right, we are going over the beginning of the Private Reclamation Blueprint, Volume 1, Final Edition. It's a step-by-step guide to the 98 EIN, estate EIN, and trust reclamation process from Patrick Devine to the modern private individual. Now, this course, we've made some additions. We've had students that have partaken in it, but we want to share this so you can see the material that we are presenting in our courses. If you like the video, please make sure to like, share, and comment, and join us in our platform, our PMA platform, for the rest of the course. Series 1 of the Patrick Devine material is 11 classes. And then we have 7 full series that we have put together. So let's begin. The Private Reclamation Blueprint, Volume 1. Disclaimer and private use notice. This ebook is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal, tax, or financial advice. The content reflects private research, historical references, and educational interpretations of Patrick Devine's teachings as expanded by Private Path. By accessing this material, you acknowledge that you are acting in your private capacity and assume full responsibility for your decisions, actions, and use of this information. No outcomes or results are guaranteed. For legal or financial matters, consult a licensed professional in your jurisdiction. This publication is a private membership educational resource of Private Path HR Solutions, PMA, and is intended solely for authorized members. It is protected under private contract and association law. Use outside of PMA jurisdiction is strictly prohibited without written consent. Usage and protection terms. This material is provided exclusively for authorized members of Private Path HR Solutions, PMA, and is protected under private contract and association law. Unauthorized sharing, reproduction, distribution, or provision of access to non-members, whether in whole or in part, constitutes a breach of the private membership agreement. In the event of a breach, the PMA reserves the right to enforce appropriate remedies, which may include suspension or termination of membership privileges, assessment of administrative fees of up to $2,500 per violation based on severity and impact, additional fees for unauthorized recording, duplication, or distribution of protected materials, pursuit of further contractual or civil remedies where applicable. All enforcement actions are applied at the discretion of the PMA and in accordance with its governing agreements. By accessing or using this material, you acknowledge and agree to these terms and the private member-only nature of this educational resource. You can contact us at www.privatepatHRsolutions.com and by email privatepatHRsolutions@gmail.com. And you can visit us on our social TikTok at Private Path HR. Copyright 2025 Private Path HR Solutions PMA, all rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced or distributed without prior written permission, except for limited educational reference. Introduction. In recent years, many individuals have sought a deeper understanding of how to properly manage their affairs through trust structures, fiduciary roles, and administrative control. Among the early voices in this space was Patrick Devine, whose work introduced key concepts such as estate administration, fiduciary capacity, and the role of proper record keeping in navigating modern financial and legal systems. His teachings provided a framework for understanding how individuals interact with public systems through documented identities, contracts, and administrative processes, while also exploring how one may operate with greater clarity, structure, and responsibility in a private capacity. However, much of his material was shared in fragmented formats, often leaving students without a clear sequence, practical application, or modern guidance, particularly in areas such as banking, documentation, and fiduciary accountability. This ebook brings those concepts into a structured step-by-step framework, clarifying the sequence, correcting common misunderstandings, and aligning the material with practical real-world application. What you'll discover in this guide. This guide is structured to present both the original concepts introduced by Patrick Devine and a clarified, modernized approach to applying those concepts in a practical and organized manner. Rather than treating these as separate sections, the guide moves progressively, beginning with Devine's foundational teachings, identifying where gaps and misunderstandings developed, and building step by step toward a complete, properly sequenced administrative framework. What this guide covers: a clear and honest summary of Patrick Devine's foundational concepts and terminology, including what he got right, where the gaps were, and how misinterpretation caused real harm to students who followed fragmented and inaccurate versions of his work. His administrative systems operate through contracts, records, and fiduciary relationships, and why understanding that layer is the foundation for everything else in this framework. How EINs function within a properly established trust and estate framework, including what they are not, and why the structure must exist before the identifier is requested. The role of the birthright trust as the foundational administrative layer, what it actually is and what it is not, and how to establish it correctly before building anything on top of it. The purpose and foundation of the estate structure, including the estate EIN, the executor's role, and how the estate layer relates to the birthright trust in proper sequence. The trust management company as the coordinating administrative arm, what it coordinates, why it exists, how it differs from the foundational layers, and why it is the correct layer for banking relationships. The private membership association and its relationship to the broader framework, including 3 types of association structure, their differences, and why founding documents and consistent administration determine whether a PMA actually functions. Practical guidance for banking, record keeping, and fiduciary administration, including which institutions work with trust structures, what documentation is required, and what financial institutions actually look for when reviewing a trust account application. How to navigate IRS interactions from a position of organized fiduciary administration, including correspondence strategy, common notices, and the administrative discipline required to maintain a consistent and defensible record over time. A complete set of supporting templates and examples, including trust declarations, trustee appointments, correspondence frameworks, and administrative records designed to illustrate structure and sequence, not to be copied verbatim. Throughout all of it, one principle remains constant: no filing, identifier, or document creates authority on its own. Authority within this framework arises from proper roles, proper records, and proper administration maintained consistently over time. Why this guide is different. Unlike materials that present isolated concepts or incomplete processes, this guide provides a structured step-by-step framework based on proper sequence and administration, clarification of commonly misunderstood terms and concepts, practical guidance for organizing records, documentation, and fiduciary responsibilities. Consistent alignment between foundational theory and real-world application, and tools and templates designed to support ongoing administration, not just initial setup. Who this guide is for. This material is intended for individuals seeking a structured understanding of trust and estate administration concepts, those interested in fiduciary roles, private administration, and organized record keeping, PMA members and operators building internal systems for education and administration, and anyone looking to move from fragmented information to a clear step-by-step framework. Understanding the language of the system. Key term clarifications before you begin. Before proceeding, it is important to clarify the terminology commonly used in this area of study. Many of the terms introduced in private education, particularly those through Patrick Devine's work, have been widely misunderstood, misapplied, or taken out of sequence. These misunderstandings often lead to improper setup, administrative errors, and unnecessary exposure. The following clarifications are provided to establish a consistent, functional understanding of the language used throughout this ebook. The 98 EIN, the Foreign Trust EIN. The original term as taught was the 98 EIN or a Foreign Grantor Trust EIN. The common misinterpretation is that obtaining a 98 EIN creates foreign status, removes one from tax jurisdiction, or establishes private standing. The proper meaning, a functional explanation, is an EIN is an administrative identifier issued based on the information provided in an application. It does not create status, jurisdiction, or authority. Within this framework, a 98 EIN may be used as an identifier for a trust structure, but only after the structure is properly established, documented, and governed. Foreign trust. The original term as taught as the foreign trust is a non-statutory trust. The common misinterpretation is that a trust becomes foreign by declaration, address, or EIN selection alone. The proper meaning, the functional explanation, is the classification of a trust is determined by its actual administration, who controls it, where decisions are made, and how it operates. Foreign, in this context, is often used as an educational descriptor, not an automatic legal status created by filing. The birthright trust. The original term as taught, the birthright trust is your foundational trust. The common misinterpretation that this trust reclaims a hidden account or automatically restores control over a pre-existing asset. The proper meaning, or the functional explanation, is the birthright trust serves as a foundational administrative record used to document private fiduciary capacity, estate interest, and internal authority. It is not a mechanism that creates assets. It is a structure used to organize and document them. The estate, for estate administration. The original term as taught is the estate or the decedent estate. The common misinterpretation is that the estate is created by filing an EIN or completing paperwork. The proper meaning, the functional explanation, is the estate exists as a matter of legal and administrative reality. An EIN simply identifies the estate for administrative purposes. The proper estate administration requires fiduciary oversight, record keeping, and documented authority, not just filings. The Trust Management Company, or TMC, or private banker. Original term as taught was the private banker or the trust management company. The common misinterpretation is that this role allows unrestricted financial control, direct access to funds, or special banking privileges. The proper meaning, in functional explanation, is the trust management company functions as the administrative and fiduciary arm of the structure. Its role is to manage records, issue resolutions, oversee operations, and maintain consistency across the trust system, not to bypass financial or regulatory processes. The executor or executor in equity. The original term as taught is the executor or executor in equity. The common misinterpretation is that this role is obtained through filings, declarations, or commercial instruments alone. The proper meaning, in functional explanation, is that the executor is the party responsible for administering the estate, managing its affairs, and directing fiduciary actions. Authority arises from proper appointment, documentation, and conduct, not from terminology or isolated filings. Status correction. The original term as taught was the status correction. Common misinterpretation is that status can be changed through a single filing or declaration that alters jurisdiction. The proper meaning, in functional explanation, is what is often referred to as status correction is more accurately understood as clarification of capacity and role through consistent administrative record keeping and conduct. It's not a switch. It is a posture reflected over time. Public versus private. The original term as taught is public versus private. Common misinterpretation is that one can simply exit the public system entirely. The proper meaning of functional explanation is, in practice, individuals operate across both public and private systems. The distinction lies in how one conducts affairs, maintains records, and interacts within defined roles, not in complete separation. Clarification. Fiduciary roles, structures, and administrative capacity. To avoid confusion, it is essential to clearly distinguish between roles on who acts and structures, what is used to act through. Many misunderstandings in this area come from treating structures such as a trust or EINs as if they have independent authority. They do not. The core distinction is the role, as in who acts, and the structures, what is used. A structure does not act. A role carried out by a person is what creates action. Define terms. A fiduciary. A fiduciary is an individual or authorized party who has a legal and administrative duty to act in the best interest of another party, such as a trust, estate, or beneficiary. A fiduciary is responsible for decision-making, record-keeping, administration, and acting with care, loyalty, and accountability. The fiduciary is a role based on duty, not a structure. Trustee. A trustee is a fiduciary who administers a trust according to its terms. A trustee manages trust property and records, executes decisions for the trust, and acts on behalf of the trust in an administrative capacity. The trustee is a specific type of fiduciary. Executor. An executor is a fiduciary responsible for administering an estate. An executor settles obligations, manages estate records, and oversees distribution and administrative closure. The executor is a fiduciary role tied specifically to the estate. Defined structures. A trust. A trust is a legal and administrative arrangement that holds property or interests, defines relationships between parties, and provides a framework for management and control. A trust does not act. It is administered by a trustee. An estate. An estate is the total collection of rights, interests, obligations, and property associated with an individual. The estate exists independently of filings. It is administered by an executor or authorized fiduciary. EIN. An employer identification number is an administrative identifier issued for reporting and organizational purposes. An EIN does not create authority, status, or jurisdiction. It only identifies a structure that must already exist. The Trust Management Company. The TMC is an administrative and operational structure used to coordinate trust activities, maintain records, issue resolutions, and oversee fiduciary operations across multiple structures. The TMC does not act independently. It is used by fiduciaries to carry out administrative functions. Why these clarifications matter. Understanding these distinctions is critical. This framework is not driven by filings, identifiers, or isolated actions. It is built on structure before expansion, governance before interface, record before remedy, and capacity before action. Without this foundation, even properly completed documents can fail in application. The role of the family office in this process. Before moving into the step-by-step structure, one critical component must be understood. None of this works without administration. This is where the family office comes in. What the family office actually is. The family office is not a trust, a filing, or EIN. It is the administrative foundation that supports everything in this system. It serves as the central record-keeping hub, the coordination point for all trust activities, the place where decisions, logs, and documentation are maintained, and the control point of communication, notices, and correspondence. Why this comes first. Many students attempt to apply for EINs, create trusts, and open accounts before establishing administration. This creates disorganized records, inconsistent documentation, banking and compliance issues, breakdown in fiduciary structure. The family office prevents that. How it integrates with the trust structure. Within this framework, the family office equals your administration and control. The birthright trust equals your foundational record of capacity. The estate equals your administrative bridge. The TMC equals your fiduciary operations. The holding trust equals your asset and operational layer, and the PMA equals your member-facing and contractual environment. The family office oversees and organizes all of it. What you should have before moving forward. Before proceeding into the step-by-step process, you should begin establishing a dedicated mailing address or PO box or business address, a document storage and record system, a basic ledger and logging process, a communication structure, email correspondence tracking, and a habit of documenting decisions and actions. You do not need perfection, but you do need structure. Our transition to Chapter 1. With the terminology clarified and the administrative foundation understood, we can now move into the step-by-step structure, beginning with the distinction between the individual, the administrative identity, and how each operates within this framework. Ready to begin? Before moving into the step-by-step process, it is important to understand the original concepts Patrick Devine introduced and how they are being clarified in this guide. The next chapter reviews the key points of Devine's 98 EIN framework, explains where the confusion developed, and prepares the reader for the modern application process with proper sequence, documentation, and fiduciary record keeping. This guide will remain consistent throughout. EINs do not create authority, trusts do not act on their own, and private administration depends on clear roles, proper records, and disciplined conduct. The EIN identifies the structure. The fiduciary acts in capacity, and the records prove the administration. Chapter 1, the Patrick Devine Method, Legacy and Limitation. The system will function as designed unless you understand how to operate within it, interpreting Patrick Devine's foundational point. Who was Patrick Devine? Patrick Devine was not a lawyer, a licensed financial advisor, or a mainstream educator. He was something more difficult to categorize. An independent thinker who spent years studying how administrative, financial, and legal systems actually function behind the scenes. His work drew from areas that most people never encountered: trust law, estate administration, fiduciary principles, and the mechanics of how institutions track, record, and interact with individuals through documented identities and formal processes. What made Devine's work valuable, and ultimately what made it prone to misuse, was that he was asking questions most people had never thought to ask. Why do institutions treat people the way they do? What roles are individuals unknowingly playing within these systems? And what would it mean to operate with genuine clarity and intentionality rather than by default? Rather than encouraging confrontation with institutions or government agencies, Devine consistently emphasized operating from a position of understanding. His core message, distilled to its essence, was that most people interact with administrative and financial systems without fully grasping the roles they occupy, the records that define them within those systems, or the capacity from which they act. His contribution was in naming that gap and in suggesting that individuals could close it through education, structure, and disciplined administration. The core idea behind his teachings. At the center of Devine's framework was a concept that sounds simple but carries significant practical weight. Capacity determines how you are treated within a system. Most individuals move through life as passive participants in processes they do not fully understand, signing documents without examining them, accepting roles without recognizing their implications, and interacting with institutions from an undefined position that those institutions fill in for them by default. Devine argued that this passivity was not inevitable. By understanding how records are created and maintained, how identities are referenced and tracked, and how roles are assigned within administrative processes, an individual could begin to operate with far greater clarity and control over their own affairs. This was not about evading responsibility or claiming special exemptions. It was about understanding the landscape clearly enough to navigate it with intention rather than confusion. That core idea, that knowledge of the system allows for more deliberate, organized, and responsible participation within it, is the foundation on which Private Path has built its educational framework. We have preserved that principle because it is sound. Where we have departed from Devine's original work is in the application, the sequence, and the language used to teach it. The role of administrative identity. One of Devine's most important insights involved what might be called the administrative identity, the way in which institutions, agencies, and financial systems interact not with a living person directly, but with a documented representation of that person stored within their records. When you open a bank account, apply for credit, or interact with a government agency, the system is working with identifiers, records, and classifications associated with your name, not with you as a living individual in any direct sense. Understanding this distinction is not a conspiracy theory. It is a straightforward description of how large administrative systems function. They operate through records, identifiers, and documented processes because that is the only practical way to manage information at scale. The identifier, whether a social security number, an account number, or a legal name, represents how the system locates and processes information connected to you. Devine's insight was the most people never examined this layer. They interact with the identifiers as if they were simply themselves, without recognizing the administrative structure it represents or the roles it places them in by default. Becoming aware of that distinction, he argued, opens the door to more deliberate and organized engagement with those systems. Private Path agrees, and we will build on this foundation throughout the guide. The 98 EIN, what was taught and where confusion developed. Among the most widely discussed elements of Devine's teachings was his use of what became known as the 98 EIN, an employer identification number assigned to structures identified in IRS records as foreign entities. In Devine's framework, EINs were presented as administrative tools used to identify trust structures, separate activities from personal identifiers, and organize records within a structured administrative system. That foundational concept is accurate and remains useful. The problem was not in what Devine's originally taught so much as in how that teaching was interpreted and passed along as it spread through various educational communities. Over time, the 98 EIN became treated as something it was never meant to be, a mechanism for changing jurisdiction, a tool for automatically establishing private status, or a key that unlocks special financial access unavailable to ordinary people. None of those interpretations are correct, and none of them reflect what a thoughtful reading of Devine's actual work supports. An EIN is, at its core, an administrative identifier. It tells the IRS and financial institutions how to classify and track a particular structure for reporting and record-keeping purposes. It does not create authority. It does not establish fiduciary capacity. It does not change a person's legal status or remove them from any jurisdiction. These are fundamental clarifications that this guide will return to repeatedly, because misunderstanding them has led many students into administrative and legal trouble that proper education would have prevented. Limitations of the original method. Acknowledging the limitations of Devine's work is not a criticism of his intentions or of the genuine value his teachings introduced. It is simply an honest assessment of where the gaps were, gaps that became costly for many of the students who tried to apply his concepts without the structure needed to make them function properly in practice. The most significant limitation was the absence of a clear, sequential framework. Devine introduced important concepts, but rarely presented them in a disciplined order that allowed students to build understanding progressively. As a result, many people encountered advanced ideas before they had developed the administrative foundation to support them. They learned about EINs before they understood what a trust actually requires. They created filings before they had established the records and roles those filings were meant to document. They adopted terminology before they grasped the practical meaning behind it. A second limitation was the lack of consistent documentation standards. Devine's teachings placed great emphasis on administrative processes, but the specific frameworks for record keeping, fiduciary documentation, and ongoing administration were often left underdeveloped. This created structures that looked organized on paper but had no real operational backbone. A problem that became apparent the moment those structures encountered real-world scrutiny from banks, agencies, and legal processes. Finally, and perhaps most consequentially, some of the terminology Devine used was conceptually rich but operationally ambiguous. Terms like private capacity, status correction, and executor in equity carry genuine meaning within a proper educational context, but without the context, they were easy to misapply. And in some educational spaces, they were actively misrepresented in ways that created real risk for the people who followed that guidance. What this guide keeps and what it corrects. Private Path has built its curriculum on a clear distinction between the parts of Devine's work that are worth preserving and the parts that need correction or clarification. That distinction is not arbitrary. It is the product of years of working with students who have tried to apply these concepts in real situations and encountered the consequences of doing so without proper guidance. What we keep is the core principle that individuals can and should understand the administrative system they operate within, that fiduciary roles and trust structures are legitimate and powerful tools when properly organized, and that operating with clarity, documentation, and intentionality produces better outcomes than operating by default. These ideas are sound. They are grounded in real law, real administrative practice, and real history. What we correct is the sequence, the language, and the interpretation. This guide presents concepts in a deliberate order, beginning with administrative foundations before moving to structures, and structures before moving to operations. It replaces ambiguous or legally problematic terminology with language that accurately describes what each element of the framework actually does. And it consistently reinforces the principle that no filing, identifier, or document creates authority on its own. Authority within this framework arises from proper roles, proper records, and proper administration over time. The foundational rule moving forward. Before moving into the step-by-step structure of this guide, one principle must be established clearly because everything that follows depends on it. The structure must exist before the identifier. The role must be defined before the action. The records must support the process, and the administration must remain consistent from the beginning through every layer that is built on top of it. This is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the difference between a structure that functions and one that collapses under examination. Every chapter in this guide is written with that sequence in mind. Risk and misunderstanding are addressed first. Administrative structure is established second, and application and execution follow last, and only once the foundation is genuinely in place. The Patrick Devine legacy matters because it pointed towards something real. This guide exists to take that pointing seriously and follow it all the way through to practical, defensible, consistently administered results. The EIN identifies the structure, the fiduciary acts in capacity, and the records prove the administration. Chapter 2, EIN Application Administrative and Administrative Identification, Step by Step. The structure must exist before the identifier. The fiduciary acts in capacity, the records support the administration. Understanding what an EIN actually is. Before a single form is filled out, before any structure is named or organized, it is essential to have a clear and accurate understanding of what an employer identification number is, and equally important, what it is not. This distinction is not a formality. It is the difference between building a structure on solid ground and building one that will create problems the moment it encounters real-world scrutiny. An EIN is an administrative identifier issued by the Internal Revenue Service. Its purpose is straightforward. It allows the IRS and financial institutions to associate activities, filings, and records with a specific entity. It functions much like a Social Security number does for an individual. Not as a grant of rights or authority, but as a tracking mechanism within an administrative system. When you apply for an EIN, you are essentially asking the IRS to assign a reference number to a structure you have described on the application form. This matters because one of the most persistent misunderstandings in private education is the belief that obtaining a particular type of EIN, especially a 98 series number, somehow creates a special legal status, establishes foreign standing, or removes a structure from IRS jurisdiction. It does none of these things. The EIN reflects the information provided in the application. It identifies a structure. It does not create one, empower one, or protect one. A structure that is improperly organized, poorly documented, or inconsistently administered will not become functional simply because it has been assigned an identifier. Keeping that principle clearly in mind from the outset will prevent a great deal of confusion as this chapter progresses. The EIN is a tool. Like any tool, its usefulness depends entirely on how well the work around it has been done. Why EINs are used within this framework. Within a properly organized trust and estate structure, EINs serve several legitimate and practical purposes. They allow different structures within the overall system to be identified and tracked separately, which creates cleaner administrative separation between layers. They enable those structures to open accounts, enter into agreements, and interact with financial institutions in an organized and documented way. And they provide a consistent reference point across records, correspondence, and filings, which is essential for maintaining the administrative coherence that this entire framework depends on. Different structures within the system typically use different EIN classifications. And understanding why each classification is used and what it actually represents is an important part of building a structure that functions consistently. The 98 series EIN is generally associated with the birthright trust and foundational fiduciary administration. A standard domestic trust classification is more commonly appropriate for operational structures. The 60 series is associated with estate administration. Each of these serves a different administrative purpose, and they should not be treated as interchangeable or selected based on perceived status value. The key principle governing EIN selection throughout this framework is consistency. The classification you choose must align with how the structure is actually organized, how it will be administered, and what it will be used for. A mismatch between the EIN classification and the actual operation of the structure is one of the most common sources of banking problems, compliance issues, and administrative breakdowns that students in this space encounter. Getting it right from the beginning requires understanding the purpose of each classification, not choosing based on what sounds most impressive. What must exist before you apply? One of the most important and most frequently ignored principles in this process is that the structure must be established before the identifier is requested. Applying for an EIN before the underlying structure is properly organized is like requesting a business license before deciding what business you are running. The identifier will be issued, but it will not correspond to anything coherent, and every administrative interaction that follows will reflect that incoherence. Before submitting any EIN application, 4 foundational elements should already be in place. The structure itself must exist, meaning a trust has been declared, its terms have been defined, and its purpose has been documented in writing. A clearly identified fiduciary must be in place. The trustee or executor who will be responsible for administering the structure must be named, appointed, and documented. Basic formation documents must be prepared: the trust declaration, the trustee acceptance, and any supporting administrative records need to be drafted and executed before the EIN application is filed. And a record-keeping system must be operational. The family office infrastructure discussed in the introduction to this guide must be functioning and ready to receive and organize the records that the EIN process will generate. Students who skip these steps and move straight to the EIN application often find themselves unable to answer basic questions from financial institutions, facing rejection when attempting to open accounts, or creating administrative inconsistencies that compound over time. The sequence is not bureaucratic box checking. It is the practical foundation on which everything else depends. Understanding your Form SS4. Form SS4 is the document used to request an EIN from the IRS. It is a relatively short form, but each field carries administrative weight, and the information provided must accurately reflect the actual structure being established. There is no universal correct way to complete this form that applies to every trust or every situation. What matters is that the information you provide is truthful, consistent with your supporting documentation, and align with how the entity will actually be administered. The IRS uses the information on Form SS4 to classify the entity, assign the appropriate EIN prefix, and establish the administrative record associated with that identifier. If the information provided does not match how the structure operates in practice, problems will emerge. either immediately when the application is reviewed or later when the entity attempts to open accounts or file returns and the classifications do not align. Accuracy and consistency are not optional. They are the basis on which the entire administrative structure rests. The following table provides practical guidance on each key field of Form SS4. This is reference material. Use it alongside your specific documentation rather than as a standalone template. Line 1, your legal name. Enter the exact name of the trust or entity as it appears in your formation documents. This must match precisely. Inconsistencies between the EIN record and your trust declaration create administrative problems downstream. Line 2, the trade name optional. Use only if the entity operates under a different name from its legal name. Leave blank if not applicable. Line 3, your fiduciary. Enter the name of the individual or entity acting in fiduciary capacity, the trustee, executor, or administrator. This person or entity is responsible for the structure and its administration. Line 4, your mailing address. Use a consistent, reliable mailing address like a P.O. box, office address, or administrative address is appropriate. This address should remain consistent across all records and correspondence associated with the structure. Line 5, physical address if different from the mailing address. Enter the location where the administration actually takes place. Line 6, your county and state. Enter the jurisdiction where administration occurs. This should reflect reality, not strategy. Line 7, your responsible party. This field identifies the individual with actual authority and control over the entity. It must reflect genuine administration, not a symbolic or fictional designation. Line 8, your entity type. Select the classification that most accurately reflects your structure. Avoid selecting classifications based on perceived status value. The classification must match how the entity is actually organized and how it will operate. Line 9, your reason for applying. Choose the reason that aligns with actual use, banking, trust administration, or business activity. Be accurate and specific. Line 10, date started. Use the date the entity was formally created or declared as documented in your formation records. Line 11, accounting period. December is most common for calendar year entities. Use the period that matches how the structure will maintain its records. Line 12, employees. Enter based on actual activity. If the structure has no employees, then enter 0. After the EIN is issued, once the IRS issues the EIN, it becomes part of the permanent administrative record of the entity. The confirmation letter should be stored immediately in the entity's records through the family office system, not filed away casually or left in an email box. That letter is a foundational document. It will be needed whenever the entity interacts with financial institutions, enters into contracts, or responds to administrative inquiries. From that point forward, every use of the EIN must remain consistent with the structure's classification and documented purpose. This is where many students encounter their first real challenge. They apply for an EIN under one set of facts, then attempt to use it in ways that contradict those facts. Presenting the entity to banks differently than it was described to the IRS, or using a foundational administrative EIN for operating banking that requires a different classification. These inconsistencies accumulate, and they become increasingly difficult to resolve as the structure grows more complex. Consistency is not a minor administrative preference. It is the structural integrity of the entire system. Financial institutions are generally far less concerned with the terminology surrounding a structure than they are with whether the documentation, the classification, and the actual administration all tell the same coherent story. A structure that tells a coherent story, one where the trust declaration, the EIN application, the account opening documents, and the ongoing records all align, will navigate banking and compliance far more smoothly than one assembled from impressive sounding parts that do not fit together. Give me one moment. The family office's role in this process. Throughout the EIN application process, the family office functions as the administrative backbone supporting every action the fiduciary takes. This distinction is worth understanding clearly. It is the fiduciary who makes decisions and takes actions. Applying for the EIN, establishing the structure, and administering its affairs. The family office is not a decision maker. It is the system through which those decisions are recorded, organized, and maintained over time. In practical terms, this means the family office is responsible for maintaining copies of all formation documents before the application is submitted, tracking application details and submission dates, storing the EIN confirmation letter and any correspondence with the IRS, recording the stated purpose and intended use of each EIN within the overall system, and ensuring that every record associated with the structure remains consistent and accessible. None of this is glamorous work, but it is the work that determines whether the structure functions reliably over time or begins to break down under its own weight. Many of the administrative failures that students in this space experience do not stem from flawed theory or incorrect filings. They stem from disorganized records, inconsistent documentation, and the absence of a functioning administrative system to support the structures that have been created. The EIN application is one of the earliest and most important opportunities to establish that discipline, and the habits developed here will carry through every layer that follows. A note on document language. As you begin preparing the documents that will support your EIN application and the broader structure, the language used in those documents deserves careful attention. This guide will provide educational templates throughout to demonstrate structure, formatting, and organizational concepts. Those templates are starting points, not finished documents to be copied verbatim. All documents should be written in clear, neutral language that accurately reflects actual administration. They should define roles and responsibilities precisely, remain consistent with operational records, and avoid language that attempts to reject jurisdiction by declaration, uses undefined or symbolic terminology, or creates inconsistency with the administrative records that institutions will review. The purpose of your documentation is to clearly and credibly describe what your structure is and how it functions, not to make legal arguments or assert special status through carefully chosen phrasing. Documents that are professionally written, administratively consistent, and clearly organized will serve your structure far better than documents filled with elaborate claims. The strength of this system has never been in its language. It has always been in its administration. Every EIN is connected to a documented structure. Every action is recorded. and every record supports the overall system. So we've provided a trustee acceptance statement. You'll be able to rewatch this video. I'm not going to go through every word of the templates, but you have your trustee acceptance statement. You have an example of a basic trust declaration structure, just to give you a guide of what the declaration structure looks like. Chapter 3, the birthright trust, foundational administrative structure. A structure must be clearly expressed and properly administered to function consistently. Starting at the foundation, every well-organized administrative system has a starting point, a foundational layer that everything else is built upon. In this framework, that starting point is the birthright trust. Before operational structures are created, before EINs are applied for, and before banking relationships are established, the birthright trust serves as the first and most fundamental expression of organized fiduciary administration. Understanding what the birthright trust actually is requires letting go of some of the more dramatic interpretations that have circulated in private education spaces. It does not automatically reclaim hidden assets. It does not create authority by declaration. It does not change jurisdiction or establish special legal status simply by being created. These misunderstandings have caused many students to rush into forming this structure with inflated expectations and to be confused and disappointed when those expectations are not met. The birthright trust is, at its core, a foundational administrative record. Its purpose is to document private fiduciary capacity, establish the organizational framework for estate-related interests, and create the starting point from which all other layers of the structure are built. It is not a magic instrument. It is the first expression of organized, intentional, documented administration, and that, properly understood, is genuinely valuable. Why this structure comes first. The sequence in which structures are established within this framework is not arbitrary. It reflects the deliberate logic. Foundational administration must precede operational activity. The birthright trust comes first because it establishes who is acting, in what capacity, and on what administrative basis, before any other structure is created or any other action is taken. Think of it this way. When a family office or private administrative system is being organized, the first task is not to open accounts or create operating entities. The first task is to establish the governance framework, the foundational document that defines roles, responsibilities, and the organizational purpose of the entire system. The birthright trust serves that function here. It is the governance layer, the documented starting point that gives everything built on top of it a coherent administrative foundation to rest on. Students who skip this step and move directly to EIN applications or operational structures often find themselves unable to answer a simple but critical question. What is this structure built on? Without a foundational administrative record that clearly establishes fiduciary capacity and organizational purpose, the structures that follow have no coherent anchor. The birthright trust provides that anchor. What the birthright trust is and is not. The birthright trust functions as a private administrative record used to organize fiduciary roles, document estate-related interests, and establish the internal authority of the fiduciary acting within the system. It is a structure, not an actor. As this guide has established from the beginning, A structure does not act on its own. The fiduciary acts through the structure, and the records document those actions over time. It is also important to understand that the birthright trust does not create assets. It organizes and documents the administration of interests that already exists. The estate, the collection of rights, interests, and relationships associated with a person's documented identity, exists independently of any filing or trust declaration. What the birthright trust does is provide a structured, documented framework through which those interests can be organized and administered with clarity and consistency. This distinction matters practically. Students who approach the birthright trust as a mechanism for creating something new, hidden wealth, secret account, or automatic exemption, will find that it does none of those things and will likely become frustrated with the process. Students who approach it as an organizational tool for documenting what already exists and establishing a clear fiduciary framework will find that it does exactly what it is designed to do, reliably and consistently. The role of the family office. Before the birthright trust is established, the family office administrative infrastructure should already be in place and functioning. This is not a minor procedural detail. It is the difference between a trust that exists within an organized system and a trust that exists on paper with nothing behind it. The family office is the administrative engine that supports the birthright trust and every structure built on top of it. It maintains the records associated with the trust, organizes correspondence and documentation, tracks fiduciary actions and decisions, and stores the trust instruments, ledgers, and administrative files that prove the structure is genuinely administered rather than simply declared. Without this infrastructure in place before the trust is formed, the trust itself has nowhere to land, no system to receive it, maintain it, or support the ongoing administration it requires. The relationship between the fiduciary and the family office is straightforward but essential to keep clear. The fiduciary establishes the trust, makes decisions about the administration, and acts in the capacity defined by its terms. The family office maintains the supporting administrative framework, the records, the correspondence tracking, the document storage, and the organizational systems that allow the fiduciary's actions to be consistently documented over time. Neither replaces the other. Both are necessary. Key components of the birthright trust. A properly organized birthright trust contains several essential components, each serving a specific administrative purpose within the overall structure. The following table identifies those components and explains the function of each one serves. Okay, the first one is the trust name. It identifies the structure within the administrative system. The name should be clear, consistent, and administratively practical, not symbolic or overly elaborate. The declaration states the intent and purpose of the trust in plain, accurate language. This is the foundational statement of what the trust is, for, and how it will be administered. The settler's information identifies the party creating the trust and establishing its terms. The trustee appointment names and formally appoints the fiduciary responsible for administering the trust. Authority arises from this appointment and from consistent fiduciary conduct, not from the title alone. Beneficiary designation identifies the party holding beneficial interest in the trust and its property. The trust purpose defines the administrative function of the trust in specific, accurate terms The purpose stated here should align with how the trust actually operates. Record-keeping provisions establishes the obligation to maintain records, ledgers, and correspondence consistently through the family office system. And the execution section documents signatures, dates, and any required acknowledgments. This section makes the declaration formally executed and administratively complete. Naming the trust. The name given to the birthright trust deserves thoughtful consideration, though not for the reasons many students assume. The name of the trust does not create authority, establish status, or signal anything legally meaningful to outside institutions. Its purpose is purely practical: identification and consistency within records and administration. A trust name should be clear, administratively coherent, and easy to maintain consistently across all documents, correspondence, and records. Names like the Smith Family Administrative Trust or John David Smith Birthright Trust accomplish exactly what is needed. They identify the structure without creating ambiguity or inviting confusion. Names filled with elaborate legal claims, symbolic language, or terminology borrowed from internet templates tend to create inconsistency problems and raise unnecessary questions when the structure encounters real-world review. The guiding principle is simple. Choose a name you can use consistently across every document, every account, and every correspondence related to this structure from the day it is established forward. Consistency is always more valuable than impressiveness. Document language and what to avoid. The language used throughout the Birthright Trust Declaration is just as important as its structure. Documents that are professionally written, clearly organized, and administratively accurate will serve the structure far better than documents filled with elaborate claims or confrontational framing. This is worth stating directly because the temptation to borrow language from online templates, many of which are written by people with no real understanding of how these structures function in practice, is one of the most common mistakes students make at this stage. Trust documents should use clear, neutral language that accurately reflects actual administration. They should define roles precisely, align with how the structure will genuinely operate, and remain consistent with every other record in the administrative system. What they should avoid is language that attempts to reject jurisdiction through declaration alone, claims immunity from law or regulations, uses undefined sovereign or redemptionist terminology, or contradicts the administrative and banking records the structure will need to maintain. The purpose of the Birthright Trust is organization and administration. Its documents should reflect that purpose clearly and without embellishment. A trust declaration that reads as a legal argument or a declaration of special status will not function better than one that reads as a straightforward administrative instrument. And in most real-world interactions, it will function considerably worse. A word on patience and sequence. One of the most important pieces of guidance this chapter can offer has nothing to do with legal structure or document language. It has to do with pace. The Birthright Trust is the beginning of a layered administrative system, not the completion of one. At this stage, the goal is to establish a foundational structure that is clearly expressed, properly documented, and genuinely administered, not to finalize every detail of a complex system whose later layers you have not yet fully understood. Whether a trust should ultimately be revocable or irrevocable, how it should interact with the operational structures that follow, how it should be positioned relative to the estate layer and the trust management company. These are questions whose answers depend on concepts introduced in later chapters of this guide. Rushing to finalize the birthright trust before those concepts are understood often means having to revise or rebuild foundational documents after the fact, which creates exactly the kind of administrative inconsistency this framework is designed to prevent. Move carefully, build what you understand, document it thoroughly, and allow the structure to develop as your understanding deepens. A smaller, consistently maintained structure will always outperform a large, hastily assembled one. The goal of this framework has never been speed. It has always been long-term consistency, organization, and disciplined administration. Why this structure matters. The birthright trust matters because everything built on top of it depends on the quality of the foundation it provides. The holding trust, the trust management company, the estate structure, the banking relationships, and the operational systems introduced in later chapters all rest on the administrative coherence established here. A birthright trust that is vague, inconsistently documented, or built on improper language creates instability that compounds with every layer added above it. Conversely, a birthright trust that is clearly expressed, properly administered, and consistently maintained creates a foundation that supports every subsequent layer with credibility and organizational coherence. Financial institutions respond to that coherence. Administrative processes recognize it, and the fiduciary operating within the system benefits from it in every interaction the structure encounters over time. This is why the sequence established throughout this guide places the birthright trust first, not because it is the most complex or most operationally active layer of the structure, but because it is the layer on which all the others depend. Get this right, maintain it consistently, and everything that follows will have solid ground to stand on. The fiduciary acts, the structure supports, and the records prove the administration. So here you have a basic trust declaration structure to keep an eye out. In your trustee and fiduciary appointment. And Chapter 4, the estate structure and estate EIN. Administrative estate functions within the framework. Administration becomes clearer when each layer of the structure has a defined purpose. Where we are in the sequence. At this point in the framework, the birthright trust has been established as the foundational administrative layer. The structure that documents fiduciary capacity, organizes estate-related interests, and provides the starting point from which everything else is built. The natural question that follows is, what exactly is being administered? The answer to that question is the estate. And the understanding the estate structure is the essential next step in building a coherent and functional private administrative system. The progression from the birthright trust to the estate structure is not arbitrary. The birthright trust establishes who is acting and in what capacity. The estate structure establishes what is being administered and on what basis. Together, these two layers form the administrative core of the entire framework. The foundation that supports the trust management company, the operational structures, and every other layer introduced later in this guide. What the estate actually is. The estate is one of the most misunderstood concepts in private education, largely because it has been surrounded by dramatic and often inaccurate interpretations that bear little resemblance to how the term is actually used in law and administrative practice. Before building an estate structure, it is essential to understand what an estate genuinely is, stripped of the mythology that has accumulated around it. In straightforward terms, the estate is the total collection of rights, interests, obligations, and property associated with an individual. Every person has an estate. It is not created by filing paperwork, obtaining an EIN, or making any kind of declaration. It exists as a matter of legal and administrative reality from the moment a person comes into being as a recognized individual within the systems that govern civil life. What those systems track, what institutions reference, and what legal processes engage with when they interact with a person. All of that is, broadly speaking, the estate. This is an important distinction to sit with. Many students come to this framework believing that the estate is something hidden, something that needs to be unlocked or reclaimed through a specific process. That interpretation is not accurate. The estate already exists. What this framework provides is not a mechanism for creating or reclaiming it. It is a structured approach to administering it with clarity, organization, and fiduciary accountability. The estate in relation to the birthright trust. Understanding how the estate and the birthright trust relate to each other is key to understanding why this chapter follows chapter 3 in the sequence. The birthright trust is the administrative structure through which the fiduciary organizes and documents their capacity to act. The estate is the body of interests, records, and relationships that the fiduciary is acting in relation to. Put another way, the birthright trust is the framework for the fiduciary role. The estate is the subject matter of that role. A trustee without a trust has no structure to act through. A trust without an estate has nothing to administer. These two elements belong together in sequence because together they create a complete administrative picture, a defined fiduciary acting through a defined structure in relation to a defined body of interests. This is why the estate layer is introduced here, immediately after the birthright trust, rather than later in the guide. Building operational structures before clearly understanding and documenting the estate they are meant to administer is one of the most common sequencing errors students make. And it creates exactly the kind of administrative incoherence this framework is designed to prevent. Clarifying the estate concept, what this is not. Because the estate concept has been so heavily mythologized in private education spaces, it is worth being direct about what this framework is not doing when it introduces estate administration. This is not a process for accessing secret government accounts linked to your birth certificate. It is not a mechanism for discharging debts through fictional financial instruments. It is not a way to reclaim money held in trust by the government on your behalf. None of those interpretations reflect reality, and pursuing them has caused serious legal and financial harm to many people who encountered them in educational spaces that presented them as fact. What this framework is doing is far more grounded and far more genuinely useful. It is providing a structured approach to understanding and organizing the administrative interests, records, and relationships that constitute your estate. And to doing so through properly documented fiduciary administration rather than through claims, declarations, or confrontational filings. That approach is legitimate, practical, and when properly maintained, genuinely effective and achieving the organizational goals this framework is designed to support. The role of the estate EIN. Just as the birthright trust uses an EIN to identify it as an administrative structure within the IRS system, the estate layer uses its own EIN for the same purpose. The estate EIN, typically associated with the 60 series prefix, identifies the estate as a distinct administrative structure for record keeping and reporting purposes. It allows estate-related activity to be tracked separately from the foundational trust layer and from the operational structures introduced later in the guide. The same principles established in Chapter 2 apply here without exception. The estate must exist, meaning it must be documented and organized before the EIN is applied for. The EIN does not create the estate, establish fiduciary authority over it, or confer any special status. It simply identifies an already existing structure for administrative purposes. And the information provided in the EIN application must accurately reflect the actual administration of the estate, who is administering it, where administration takes place, and what the structure is being used. The estate EIN and the birthright trust EIN serve different administrative purposes and should be kept clearly separate in records and operations. Confusing these two layers using the estate EIN where the foundational trust EIN is appropriate or vice versa creates exactly the kind of administrative inconsistency that leads to banking problems and compliance issues down the line. Administrative separation between layers. One of the most important concepts introduced at this stage of the framework is administrative separation. As the structure grows to include multiple layers, the birthright trust, the estate, and eventually the trust management company and operational structures, maintaining clear separation between those layers becomes increasingly critical. Administrative separation means that each layer of the structure has a clearly defined purpose, its own documentation, its own EIN where appropriate, and its own records maintained consistently through the family office system. It means that the activities of one layer do not bleed into another, that the records of each layer tell a coherent and independent story, and that the fiduciary can clearly explain the purpose and function of each element of the system at any time. The table below summarizes how the layers introduced so far relate to each other and what each one is primarily responsible for within the overall framework. So structure primary administrative function. The birthright trust is the foundational fiduciary administration. It establishes the fiduciary's capacity, documents organizational purpose, and anchors the entire administrative system. The estate structure is the administrative estate function. It organizes and documents the interests, records, and relationships associated with the individual's documented identity within the institutional system. The estate EIN identifies the estate as a distinct administrative structure for record keeping and reporting. It does not create authority, and it identifies an already administered structure. The family office, for record keeping and long-term governance, maintains all records, correspondence, ledgers, and documentation across every layer of the structure. The executor's role in estate administration. The executor is the fiduciary responsible for administering the estate, managing its records, overseeing its obligations, and directing the administrative actions taken in relation to it. Within this framework, the executor role is closely related to the trustee role established through the birthright trust, and in many cases, the same individual serves in both capacities. What matters is that the role is clearly defined, formally documented, and consistently exercised. As with every other element of this framework, the executor's authority does not arise from terminology, titles, or declarations. It arises from formal appointment, documented acceptance of fiduciary responsibility, and consistent conduct in administering the estate over time. An executor who maintains organized records acts with care and accountability and keeps the estate's administration consistent with its documented purpose will always be a stronger position than one who has the right paperwork but none of the administrative discipline behind it. The family office in estate administration. The family office continues to serve as the administrative backbone of this layer of the structure. Just as it does for the birthright trust, estate-related records including correspondence with institutions, notices, fiduciary appointments, ledgers, and administrative resolutions should all be organized and maintained through the family office system rather than scattered across disconnected files or informal storage. As the structure becomes more layered, the importance of centralized administration only increases. Each new layer added to the system generates new records, new correspondence, and new administrative obligations. Without a functioning family office infrastructure to receive, organize, and maintain all of that material, the structure will begin to show inconsistencies very quickly. And those inconsistencies will compound with every additional layer that is added on top. The discipline established at the family office level in the early stages of building this framework is an investment that pays dividends throughout the life of the entire system. Students who take that discipline seriously from the beginning will find every subsequent layer easier to establish and easier to maintain. Those who treat it as a secondary concern will encounter increasingly difficult as the structure grows. A practical perspective on estate administration. Estate administration, properly understood, is fundamentally about organization, fiduciary responsibility, documentation, and consistency of records. It is not about making dramatic claims, filing confrontational notices, or asserting special status through carefully worded declarations. The strength of an estate structure, like the strength of every other element in this framework, depends far more on the quality of its ongoing administration than on sophistication and of its initial setup. Students who approach estate administration with the understanding will find it to be a genuinely useful organizational tool. It provides a structured way to document and manage the interests and relationships associated with their documented identity, to maintain clear records of fiduciary activity, and to create the administrative separation between personal affairs and structured administration that this framework is designed to support. What it will not do is create shortcuts, discharge obligations, or produce results through paperwork alone. Those expectations have led many people into serious difficulty, and this guide exists in part to redirect students away from them and toward an approach that is grounded, sustainable, and genuinely effective over time. What comes next? With the birthright trust and estate structure established and properly documented, the framework now has its administrative core in place. The fiduciary capacity has been defined and documented. The body of interest being administered has been identified and organized. The records supporting both layers are being maintained through the family office system. The next step is to introduce the coordinating administrative layer that ties these structures together and supports their ongoing operation, the Trust Management Company. Chapter 5 explains what the TMC is, why it exists within the framework, and how it functions as the organizational bridge between the foundational layers established in chapters 3 and 4 and the operational activity that follows. The estate exists, the fiduciary administers it, and the records prove the administration. A note on settlement and operational activity. One of the most common points of confusion students encounter at this stage involves the relationship between the estate structure and operational or settlement activity. It is worth addressing this directly before moving forward, because misunderstanding it leads to some of the most significant administrative and banking problems in this space. The estate structure, as established throughout this chapter, is an administrative layer. Its purpose is to organize and document the interests, records, and relationships associated with the individual's documented identity, not to serve as an operational account, a settlement vehicle, or a primary banking structure. Using the estate layer for operational banking, payment processing, or settlement activity contradicts its documented administrative purpose and creates exactly the kind of inconsistency between records and actual use that financial institutions flag and regulators scrutinize. Operational activity and settlement functions are handled through the trust management company and the operational structures introduced in later chapters of this guide. That separation is not arbitrary. It reflects a deliberate design principle that keeps each layer of the framework doing what it is documented to do and nothing beyond that. The estate administers, the TMC coordinates, the operational structures execute. Keeping these roles clearly separated in both documentation and practice is what allows the overall system to function consistently over time. When students blur those lines, treating the estate as an operational tool or attempting to use administrative structures for functions they were not designed to perform, the result is almost always administrative breakdown, banking friction, or compliance exposure that could have been avoided entirely with proper sequencing and role clarity. The discipline required here is the same discipline required throughout this entire framework. Every structure does what it is documented to do, and the records consistently reflect that reality. Chapter 5, the Trust Management Company. Coordinating administration across the structure. Strong administration creates consistency across every layer of the structure. The bridge between foundation and operation. By the time the student reaches this chapter, two foundational layers of the administrative system are in place. The birthright trust has established the fiduciary capacity and the organizational framework through which private administration is conducted. The estate structure has identified and organized the body of interest being administered. Together, those two layers form the administrative core of the system. What is missing at this point is coordination. As an administrative system grows, adding documentation, correspondence, records, banking relationships, and eventually operational activity, the need for a centralized coordinating layer becomes increasingly apparent. Without it, each structure begins to operate in relative isolation. Records become inconsistent across layers, and the fiduciary loses the organizational coherence that makes the system functional. The trust management company exists to prevent that breakdown. The TMC is the coordinating administrative layer of the framework. It does not replace the birthright trust or the estate structure. It supports and connects them. It functions as the organizational bridge between the foundational layers established in the earlier chapters and the operational activity that follows. Understanding what it is, what it does, and just as importantly, what it is not, is essential before proceeding further in the sequence. What the TMC actually is. The TMC is, in practical terms, a private administrative office. Its purpose is organization, not ownership. not authority, and not independent operation. It exists to centralize the administrative functions that would otherwise be scattered across multiple structures without coherent point of coordination. Think of it as the operational headquarters of the system, the place where records are coordinated, resolutions are issued, correspondence is managed, and the consistency of the overall administrative framework is maintained. This distinction between coordination and authority is worth dwelling on because it is frequently misunderstood. In many educational spaces, the TMC has been presented as the kind of private bank or financial control center, a structure that provides unrestricted access to funds or special financial privileges unavailable through normal channels. That interpretation is not accurate, and pursuing it has created serious problems for students who acted on it. The TMC does not hold funds on behalf of the fiduciary. It does not provide special banking access and does not function as a payment processor or settlement vehicle. But its role is administrative coordination, and that is precisely what makes it valuable within a properly organized system. The fiduciary remains the decision maker throughout. The TMC is the structure through which those decisions are coordinated, documented, and maintained. It supports the fiduciary's administration. It does not replace or override it. Why this layer is necessary. Students sometimes question why the TMC is necessary at all. If the birthright trust and estate structure are already in place and the family office is maintaining records across both, why introduce another layer of administration? The answer becomes clear as the system grows beyond its foundational elements. When a fiduciary is operating a single trust with a handful of documents, the organizational demands are manageable. But as the structure expands, adding an estate layer, eventually an operational structure, banking relationships, contracts, correspondence with multiple institutions, and ongoing record-keeping obligations across all of it, the administrative load grows significantly. Without a centralized coordinating layer, the fiduciary ends up managing the details of each structure separately, with no unified system for ensuring consistency across all of them. The TMC solves that problem by creating a single administrative center through which all coordination flows. It maintains the records of trust activity across structures, issues internal resolutions that document decisions affecting multiple layers of the system, oversees fiduciary scheduling and administrative timelines, and ensures that the documentation, operations, and records of each layer remain aligned with one another. In a well-organized system, the TMC is the structure that makes everything else easier to maintain. How the structures work together. At this stage of the framework, it is useful to see all of the layers introduced so far laid out, clearly in relation to one another. Each structure has a distinct primary role, and understanding those roles in relation to each other is what allows the fiduciary to maintain clear administrative separation as the system grows. The birthright trust is the foundational administrative structure. It establishes fiduciary capacity and organizational purpose, the anchor of the entire system. The estate structure is the administrative estate layer, organizes the documents and interests, and records records associated with the individual's documented identity. The TMC is the coordinating administrative layer, centralizes record coordination, internal resolutions, correspondence management, and consistency across all structures. And the family office, long-term record keeping and governance, maintains all documentation files and administrative records across every layer of the system. Reading this table, it becomes clear that the framework is not a collection of separate structures operating independently. It is an ecosystem in which each layer serves a specific function, and all layers depend on consistent fiduciary administration to operate effectively. Adding more layers does not automatically create a stronger system. What creates a stronger system is ensuring that each layer is clearly defined, properly documented, and consistently maintained in relation to all the others. The EIN layer of the TMC. The trust management company, when properly organized within this framework, typically uses an 81 or 82 series EIN, a classification associated with domestic administrative and management structures. This is distinct from the 98 series EIN associated with the birthright trust and the 60 series associated with the estate layer. Each EIN classification reflects the administrative character of the structure it identifies, which is why maintaining clear separation between them is so important. The same principles established in Chapter 2 apply here without modification. The TMC must be properly organized and documented between the EIN is applied for. The application must accurately reflect the actual administration of the structure, and the use of the EIN must remain consistent with the TMC's documented purpose as a coordinating administrative entity, not as an operational bank account, a payment processor, or a financial instrument of any kind. Students who attempt to use the TMC EIN for purposes inconsistent with its documented administrative role will encounter the same banking and compliance problems that arise from another inconsistency between records and actual operations. The principle is always the same. The records must tell a coherent, consistent, and accurate story about what each structure is and what it does. Operational uses of the TMC. Within a well-organized administrative system, the TMC can coordinate a range of administrative functions depending on how the overall structure is organized and what the fiduciary's long-term goals require. At its most basic level, the TMC handles trust administration, coordination, internal resolutions, document management, and correspondence across the structures it supports. As the system develops, it may also coordinate invoicing for services rendered through the administrative system, fiduciary scheduling and administrative timelines, contracts and agreements entered into on behalf of the structure it supports, and PMA-related administration where applicable. The important principle governing all of these uses is that the TMC actual activity must remain aligned with its documented purpose. A TMC that is documented as an administrative coordination entity but is being used for operational banking or settlement activity has the same problem as any other structure operating outside its documented role. It creates inconsistency that erodes the credibility and functionality of the entire system. Students should also resist the temptation to expand the TMC's role too quickly. Starting with the core administrative functions, record coordination, internal resolutions, and correspondence management, and allowing the structure to grow as the fiduciary's understanding and organizational discipline develop is almost always a more effective approach than attempting to build a comprehensive operational system before the foundational administration is fully established. Administrative consistency across the system. By this point in the guide, the theme of administrative consistency has appeared in every chapter, and it appears again here because it becomes more important, not less, as the system grows in complexity. A system with one structure and one EIN has limited surface area for inconsistency. A system with a birthright trust, an estate layer, a TMC, and a family office supporting all of them has many more points at which the records, the documentation, and the actual operation of each structure must align. The TMC is in many ways the structure most responsible for maintaining that alignment across the system. Because it coordinates administration across multiple layers, it is the natural point at which inconsistencies, if they exist, will surface. A TMC that is functioning well will catch those inconsistencies early and allow the fiduciary to address them before they create larger problems. A TMC that is functioning poorly and that exists only on paper without genuine administrative activity behind it provides no such protection. Financial institutions, agencies, and legal processes that interact with this system will generally respond to one thing above all others. Does this structure make sense? Does the records tell a coherent story? And does the fiduciary understand what they have built and why? A well-administered TMC coordinating a well-documented system of foundational and operational structures answers all of those questions affirmatively. That is the standard this framework is designed to help students reach. A practical caution on complexity. Before closing this chapter, it is worth addressing a tendency that becomes particularly pronounced at this stage of the framework: the temptation to add complexity of its own sake. Some students, upon reaching the TMC chapter, immediately begin thinking about how to expand the system further, adding additional entities, applying for multiple EINs, creating elaborate organizational charts that look impressive on paper. That impulse, while understandable, is worth resisting. A large structure with poor bookkeeping, inconsistency records, and weak administration will always underperform a smaller structure that is consistently and carefully maintained. The TMC is valuable because it creates organizational coherence, but it can only create that coherence if the fiduciary has the administrative discipline to maintain it properly. More structures without more discipline simply means more surface area for inconsistency. The measure of a strong administrative system is not its size or its complexity. It is whether every layer of the system is clearly defined, consistently documented, and genuinely administered over time. Build what you can maintain. Maintain what you build. Allow the system to grow as your administrative discipline grows with it. The TMC and banking, establishing the settlement layer. While the trust management company functions primarily as the coordinating administrative layer of the framework, it is also the appropriate structure within the system for maintaining a formal banking relationship. Specifically, the TMC is where a dedicated settlement account is established, the layer through which formally documented financial activity connected to the broader administrative system flows. This is an important distinction from the foundational layers introduced earlier in this guide. The birthright trust and the estate structure are administrative in nature. They organize, document, and establish the fiduciary framework. The TMC, by contrast, is the layer where administration meets operation. It is the point at which the structure begins to interface with the financial system in a direct and practical way. The settlement account maintained through the TMC serves a specific and clearly documented purpose. It is not a personal account. It is not a general operating account or everyday expenses. It exists as the designated financial layer of the administrative system, the account through which properly documented financial activity is received, recorded, and administered in accordance with the fiduciary obligations of the TMC. Setting up this banking relationship requires the same discipline and consistency that governs every other element of this framework. The TMC's documentation, its EIN, its stated purpose, and its actual banking activity must all tell the same coherent story. A financial institution opening an account for an administrative trust structure will want to see organized, professional documentation that clearly describes what the entity is and what the account is for. That documentation should be ready before the banking conversation begins. It is also worth noting that it is also worth noting that this volume is the beginning of that understanding, not the end of it. Each layer introduced in this guide plays a specific role in a larger system, and the full picture of how those layers interact with each other in practice is developed progressively throughout this series. What matters at this stage is that the TMC is properly established, correctly documented, and clearly understood as the layer within the framework that holds the banking relationship for the system as a whole. What comes next? With the birthright trust, the estate structure, the TMC, and the family office all established and understood in relation to one another, the administrative core of this framework is complete. The foundational layers are in place. The coordinating layers is operational, and the record-keeping infrastructure supports all of it. The next chapter introduces the Private Membership Association, a structure that operates at the interface between the private administrative system built in these chapters and the member-facing contractual environment through which Private Path delivers its educational programs. Understanding the PMA, its legitimate uses, and its proper relationship to the structures introduced in this guide is the final conceptual piece before moving into advanced topics and operational guidance. The fiduciary acts, the TMC coordinates, the family office records, and the system functions. Chapter 6, the Private Membership Association, the member-facing layer of the framework. A properly organized association operates through clear membership, defined purpose, and consistent private administration. Important notice: before establishing any PMA, students are strongly encouraged to complete the PMA series offered through Private Path. The concepts introduced in this chapter are foundational. The PMA series provides the full depth of educational documentation guidance and administrative instruction necessary to build and maintain a PMA correctly. Proceeding without that foundation significantly increases the risk of structural and legal error. Where the PMA fits in this framework. The 5 chapters preceding this one have built the internal administrative framework of the private system. The foundational trust, the estate layer, the coordinating TMC, and the family office infrastructure supporting all of it. Each of those layers operates within a private administrative system, organized and maintained by the fiduciary for the purpose of clear, documented, and consistent administration of private affairs. The Private Membership Association introduces a different dimension to the framework, where the earlier layers are primarily internal, organizing the fiduciary's own capacity, interests, and administrative operations. The PMA is the layer that faces outward. It is the structure through which the private system interacts with members, delivers services, enters into contractual relationships, and operates in the space between fully private administration and the public-facing world. Understanding where the PMA sits in this progression is essential. It is not a replacement for the foundational layer. It is not a shortcut around them. It is an additional layer that rests on top of the administrative foundation already established. And like every other layer in this framework, it functions well only when that foundation is properly in place beneath it. What a private membership association actually is. A private membership association is an organization formed through private contract among its members for a defined shared purpose. Its legal basis rests on the constitutional rights of free association and privacy, the right of individuals to come together voluntarily, define the terms of their association, and conduct their shared affairs under those terms without unnecessary public interference. In practical terms, a properly organized PMA operates within a private contractual environment defined by its membership agreement. Members voluntarily enter that environment by agreeing to the terms of the association. The association delivers its services, programs, and resources to members within that private contractual space. And the administration of the association, its governance, its records, its financial management, and its members' relationships. It is conducted according to its founding documents and governing agreements rather than through public corporation structures. This is a legitimate and well-established organizational form with genuine legal grounding. Churches, professional associations, private clubs, and many educational organizations have operated as PMAs for decades. What makes a PMA genuinely private and genuinely protected is not a declaration or a filing. It is the quality of its founding documents, the consistency of its administration, and the clarity of its membership relationships. A PMA that is properly organized and consistently administered is a structurally sound vehicle for delivering private educational and administrative services to members. The three types of PMA structure, understanding the differences. One of the most important concepts in this chapter and one of the most frequently misunderstood in private education spaces is that not all PMAs are the same. There are meaningful different types of association structures, each with different legal characteristics, different disclosure obligations, and different tax treatment, and different relationships to public regulatory systems. Choosing the wrong structure or failing to understand the difference between them is one of the most common and consequential mistakes students make at this stage. The table below introduces the three primary structures relevant to this framework and summarizes their key characteristics. This is foundational orientation. The PMA series provides the full depth of education on each of these structures that this chapter cannot. And then you have your 501c3 organization. It's federally recognized nonprofit organization. It's tax-exempt status granted by the IRS. Donations may be tax deductible for contributors. It is required to file your annual public disclosures Form 990 and subject to IRS oversight and public transparency requirements. Considerations, important considerations is full public disclosure of finances, governance, and operations. The IRS retains significant oversight authority and restrictions on political activity and private benefit. Not a private structure, it operates within the public regulatory framework. The 508c1a is a faith-based association that is generally treated as tax-exempt without applying for a formal IRS recognition. It operates under religious liberty protections and does not typically seek a 501c3 determination. The important considerations are it must have a genuine faith-based or religious organizational purpose. It does not eliminate all legal obligations, and misuse outside the legitimate religious context can create significant legal exposure, and this requires careful and honest organizational documentation. For a fully private PMA, it operates through private contract and association principles. Member relationships are governed by the membership agreement and internal governing documents, and it functions outside the traditional public corporate nonprofit structure. The important considerations is the strength of the structure depends on the quality of its founding documents and the consistency of its administration. Private does not mean exempt from all laws or obligations. It requires disciplined governance, clear member agreements, and consistent operational procedures. So here on this table, we have the IRS recognition required, public disclosure requirements, and a member contract base. What will happen if you have the 501c3, 508, and the private PMA. So reading this table carefully, a clear pattern emerges. The more public the structure, the 501c3 being the most public, the more regulatory oversight and disclosure it involves. But also, the more established and recognized its legal framework is. The more private the structure, the fully private PMA being the most private, the more its effectiveness depends on the quality of its internal administration and founding documents, and the less it can rely on external regulatory recognition to establish its legitimacy. This is why the PMA series is so important before attempting to establish any of these structures. The difference between them are not merely technical. They are fundamental and to how the organization will function, what obligations it carries, and what risks it faces if it is improperly organized or administered. The fully private PMA and the commercial trust, understanding the relationship. Within this framework, the fully private PMA operates in close relationship with the commercial trust. And understanding how these two structures relate to each other is one of the most important concepts of this chapter. The fully private PMA remains entirely within the private contractual environment. It operates through its membership agreement, delivers services to members within the private space, and maintains its administration under private association law. It does not register publicly, does not operate as a public corporate entity, and does not enter into a public commercial system. The commercial trust, by contrast, serves as the public-facing operational arm of the system. It is the structure that interfaces with the public commercial world, entering into contracts with vendors and service providers, maintaining public-facing banking relationships, and conducting the operational activity that requires engagement with public systems. It is organized and administered as a legitimate commercial entity, with all of the documentation, accounting, and compliance that entails. The relationship between the two is one of clear functional separation. The PMA stays private, the commercial trust interfaces publicly. Together, they allow the overall system to operate effectively across both environments, delivering private education and administrative services to members through the PMA while conducting necessary public-facing commercial activity through the commercial trust. Maintaining that separation clearly in both documentation and actual operation is what keeps each structure functioning as it is designed to function. Blurring that separation, using the private PMA for activity that belongs into the commercial trust, or allowing the commercial trust public-facing activity to contaminate the private character of the PMA is one of the most common structural errors at this level. The PMA series addresses this in detail and provides the documentation frameworks necessary to maintain that separation correctly over time. Why proper founding documents are everything. If there is one principle that governs PMA administration above all others, it is this. The strength of the private membership association is only as strong as its founding documents and the consistency in which those documents are administered. A PMA that is declared into existence without proper founding documents, a clear membership agreement, defined governance structures, and organized records is not a functioning private association. It is a label without a structure behind it. The founding documents of a PMA, the Articles of Association, the membership agreement, the statement of purpose, and the governing bylaws or operating rules define everything about how the association operates. They establish who the members are and how they join. They define what the association does and does not do. They set the terms under which services are delivered and disputes are resolved. And they establish the governance framework through which the association is administered over time. These documents must be drafted carefully, reviewed thoroughly, and maintained consistently from the moment the association is established. They cannot be copied from internet templates without adaptation. They cannot be treated as boilerplate, and they cannot be drafted without clear understanding of what type the PMA is being established and what legal framework governs it. This is precisely why the PMA series exists and why completing it before attempting to establish a PMA is not optional guidance, but essential preparation. The PMA within the broader administrative framework. Positioning the PMA correctly within the broader administrative framework built in earlier chapters is the final important concept of this chapter introduces. The PMA is not a standalone structure that operates independently of the birthright trust, the estate, and the TMC. It is a layer that integrates with those structures and depends on the administrative foundation they provide. Family Office supports the PMA's administration just as it supports every other layer of the system. Maintaining its records, organizing its correspondence, and ensuring that its documentation remains consistent over time, the TMC may coordinate certain administrative functions between the PMA and other layers of the system where appropriate, and the foundational fiduciary capacity established through the birthright trust and estate structure provides the administrative backbone from which the fiduciary operates in their role within it. Understanding the PMA as part of the integrated system rather than a separate and independent structure is what allows it to function at its full potential. Each layer of this framework was designed to support the others. The PMA is no exception. Remember, the PMA series covers everything introduced in this chapter in full detail, including founding document templates, membership agreement guidance, governance structures, banking considerations, and the full distinction between 501c3, 508c1a, and the fully private PMA structures. Complete the PMA series before proceeding with any PMA establishment. And what comes next, this one goes into the holding trust, and I'm going to cut it off here because we're already 2 hours in. And I want you guys to come and join our program. We have a lot more detailed information in our series. You can see what each series entails, what volumes we cover. We invite you to come and join us. So to get the rest of this information, you will receive the ebooks on our website once you join to be a member and then register for the class. I'm not open on the class yet for the Patrick Devine. We will have that starting June 15th. You will be able to sign up. We have an introductory rate of $199 for the 11-part course of Series 1. So make sure you sign up and join by the 15th of June when we will have Patrick Devine Series 1 available. And remember to like, share, and comment on our YouTube page so that way we know that you enjoyed the material. Have a great night.